So the first question here is discuss the limitations of using GDP as a measure of well-being of the country. So as we know that GDP is the mainstream measure which is being employed by um, all the economies. So there are certain limitations inherent in the GDP as a measure of well-being of the country. So we have to discuss those limitations. So approach should be introduced briefly GDP and its association with well-being, and come to the question: what are the limitations of GDP with respect to usage as an indicator for welfare of the country, as a key welfare indicator? And then we have to conclude on what could be the other possible indicators of well-being apart from GDP, knowing that there are certain limitations. So GDP is the sum total of value of goods and services created within the geographical boundary of a country in a particular year. Standard definition. It's usually taken as a measure of indicator of well-being of the in the context of per capita income, suggesting that prosperity of people. So GDP, taking into account the per capita income, divided with the whole population, so suggesting the prosperity of the people. It may indicate more income and capacity to buy more goods, so indicate the purchasing power of the population and services among the people. So this is what GDP largely indicates, connected with per capita income and population. However, there are some limitations. GDP as an indicator. First is the uneven distribution of GDP. As we know, that GDP is just a crude number, so it might mask the inherent regional differences or the unevenness in GDP. If GDP of a country is rising, the economic well-being may not rise as a consequence. This we must always remember that though India was growing, but we were growing at a jobless pace, which means the growth is non-inclusive. So it may not indicate an inclusive growth. So this is because the rise in GDP may be concentrated. Exactly, rise in GDP may be concentrated in the hands of few people or firms. So there might be few people who are growing than others. For the rest, the income, in fact, may have fallen. It might also become negative. This is one sense. So in such cases, welfare of the country may not reflect the per capita GDP. So this is one important dimension which we must remember. And then it also doesn't measure the non-monetary exchanges or non-marketed activities. So GDP only tries to monetize, only measures those activities which are monetized. But there are certain large sections of the economy which are not monetized at all. Many activities of the economy are not evaluated in monetary terms. For example, take the domestic work. The domestic work that woman performs at home is not paid for. Uh, and For example, the barter exchange that take place in informal sector. Informal sector even today runs based on trust. So those exchanges are not counted for, are not registered as part of the economic activity. So in developing countries where many remote regions are underdeveloped, these kinds of barter exchange are common, especially in developing countries. So in the remote and underdeveloped countries, the exchanges develop take place through barter only, even today also. It's a give and take, but they are generally not counted in GDP of this country. Since these exchanges are not counted in GDP, um, you can also say that GDP may be there may be chance of underestimation of GDP. Hence, GDP calculated in standard manner may not give us clear indication of the productive activity and well-being of the country. So this is act of omission where GDP omits the non-monetized activity. We can add example to this of care economy. Care economy largely attribute to the role done by women in the household sphere. For example, domestic work, as already been discussed. So, these care economic activities are not counted for, and then GDP also has certain externalities. So, externalities refer to it may be benefits or also harms, which is taking place, which GDP is not counting of a firm of an individual cost to another, for which they are not paid or penalized. Normally, externalities, if negative, has to be paid or penalized or compensated, but this GDP doesn't count. Externalities do not have any market in which they can be bought or sold. So this is the key line of thought which means that there's no market to buy and sell externalities. That's why it's not counted. For example, take any industry, they are polluting in nature. This pollution is not minused when we calculate GDP. The output of a refinery is the amount of oil it refines. When we see in oil refinery industry, we're just seeing it as an output in terms of oil. But the value added of the refinery will be counted as part of GDP. But in carrying out the production of oil refinery, it may also be polluting the nearby river. In fact, this is the case with many industries where almost rivers are being polluted because of the discharge of effluents. So this may cause harm not just to the river. See, river we are seeing as an ecosystem, but also river on a larger ecology. The role it plays in larger ecology, harming the people who use the water of the river, who are dependent on the river for their livelihood. Hence, well-being will fail in this context. because it's creating a clear negative externality in terms of river pollution. So in this case, GDP will not take into account such negative externalities. Therefore, if we take GDP as a measure of welfare of the economy, we will be overestimating the actual well-being. So we saw a case where we are underestimating things, but here we are overestimating the well-being. There can be cases of positive externalities as well. In such cases, GDP will underestimate. So if externality is positive, it's good, fine, but it will underestimate in that case also. So thereby not reflecting the actual well-being of the economy. So, in addition to the GDP, GDP also does not take into account the economic inequality. So, as we discussed, growth may be driven by some sections. That's why it might not reflect the economic inequality. It might also not reflect the changes which are taking place in the economy in terms of lost jobs, unemployment characteristics, opportunities, and the level of health and education and the quality of choices in an economy. So these things may not be reflected in the GDP one sense. So these are all true things which keep on happening on a daily basis: economic inequality, the loss of jobs due to unemployment because of various reasons, maybe cyclical, maybe frictional, and opportunities whether they are equal for all, equality of opportunity. What is the level of health and education in the how it is getting reflected in the GDP, quality of choices in an economy. Therefore, new concepts which are coming to the forefront are concepts like gross national happiness. We have seen happiness index be coming into the forefront as a measure of well-being. Human development index is also an important measure of measuring progress, human development, capabilities approach, and the social progress index also whether society is progressing in the right direction, and often are often discussed as better alternatives to assess the well-being of society. In addition to this, we can also add points like green GDP, the concept of green GDP, which is emanating circular economy, trying to measure so such things can add or overcome the limitations of GDP, and even counting the making the economy, informal economy, more formal, on steps towards digitization, and such things are in the right direction to address the informal nature of economy. But still, the growth, the larger issue of growth being non-inclusive, those has to be addressed to specific policies.